Our next speaker is Eve Fairbanks, who has been in South Africa for the last 2 years. For those of you with good memories, you may remember that Eve went to South Africa originally to write about medical culture and the clash of traditional and modern medical cultures. And when she arrived there, she found that something else was very interesting to her, and that was, here was a class of proud people, the Afrikaners, who found themselves out of power, and yet they still had a very strong sense of cultural and social identity, and they were having to adjust to a society where they had lost political power. And Eve, when Eve proposed to do this, I mean, I'm not an expert on South Africa, I will tell you, but we do have experts. And so Eve wrote a rather detailed proposal about what she wanted to do. And I'm going to ask people to raise their hands. I sent it around to Jamie Workman, Sharon Dorisami, and Kitty Hempstone. Raise your hands, all. This is my South African brain trust. And they looked at the proposal and said, this is a great idea. Because there's been a lot of attention to Black South Africa and the successes and failures of South African democracy. But in a sense, there's been a lot of neglect of Afrikaners. And so Eve sort of buckled down and learned Afrikaans and immersed herself in that society, not exclusively in white society in South Africa. But I mean, I really admire what Eve accomplished, because she took us inside the heads of people who were coping with a sense of social dissonance and a sense of being rejected by history. And what we learned, and what I learned from you can look at people, what people say and they behave, and she had a personal encounter with racism, but we also learned that racists are people, and sometimes what looks like racism isn't really racism. It's a much more complicated reaction to cultural and economic clash, and Eve managed to capture that beautifully in her newsletters, and I think it just made a tremendous contribution, and I know that you will enjoy the presentation she's about to make. Welcome, Eve.
Hi. I just got back from South Africa on Wednesday, so thank you so much, Steve, for that kind introduction. And I want to say, she's over there. Thank you to Pooja for such an interesting talk, and it was so interesting for me to hear too, because actually what Pooja talked about at the beginning of her discussion, a sense of apocalypse and this place is going to burn, is so much of what I heard also all the time in South Africa. And I was so interested in her idea. I loved her idea that one of the things driving that conviction of coming apocalypse was guilt, because that rang true to me from my experience in South Africa, in the sense that sort of like if there's a moral physics, then these two places are places that defy those laws, and therefore inevitably someday they must melt down, and so that just was so interesting for me to hear that in a different context. I'm going to talk about a sort of certain window onto South Africa, but I just want to say that if you have questions about other aspects of South Africa, it's a huge place, a diverse place. Please just ask me about anything afterwards. So, first I just want to draw your attention to this photo. It was taken in '93, 3 years after Nelson Mandela was released from prison. That is Mandela, of course. There's something unmistakably lovable about even the back of his fuzzy gray head. And he's speaking to a group of boys at the historically all-white King Edward VII School in Johannesburg, which was founded in the early 20th century, just after the end of the Anglo-Boer War. It's an arresting photo, or I find it best, the white of the black student's teeth as he smiles, and this grimacing white guy in the front slumped over on, it looks like he's on crutches. And so you can see why Time magazine chose to print it huge, to introduce its cover spread on South Africa's upcoming democratic elections in '94, because it simultaneously seems to depict what is and what will be. Mandela here is living reconciliation. He's preaching to a Tony white school. He's accepting them. He's even embracing his former oppressors, still dressed up in all their regalia of power. And yet everybody here was poised on the brink of a transformation. And you can tell the kids know it. Their faces seem to reflect not only the emotions of the moment, but anticipation. So the black student is thrilling in his expanded future, and the white boys are glimpsing future disappointments. If these guys were around 15 in '93, then they would have been around 30 in 2008, when I arrived in South Africa as an ICWA fellow. I landed in Cape Town, and my first weekend, my American landlord, Paul, friend of Jamie Rookman, invited me to a wine and cheese festival on a historic farm just outside the city. And I actually felt a little guilty going to this wine and cheese festival in South Africa. I wanted to immerse in Africa, like real Africa, a Zulu wedding, or hip-hop in Johannesburg. And my nascent understanding of Paul's expat-heavy social scene led me to assume this festival would cater to World Bank types. When I got there, I realized that the event was totally South African. The music playing was in Afrikaans. The festival goers seemed to be 30-somethings roaming in packs, and they were speaking Afrikaans. The scene could have been Napa Valley. Along with cheese, there were stalls that were selling the most hilariously haute bourgeois foodstuffs, like pink peppercorn, chocolate bars, or organic walnut grappa honey. And the centerpiece of this whole thing, I remember, under a big tent, was a stall that was selling hydroponically grown Belgian endives. And there was a woman in a silk hat that was shaped like an endive leaf, kind of curling over, and she was handing out complimentary olive tapenade. But this was not very Napa, the clientele. I felt that the festival goers would have looked more at home at rodeo days in Cheyenne. On top, they were wearing like sweaty rugby jerseys, and around the neck, many of them had these devices that held their wine glasses so they could drink hands-free, like a wine drinker's version of the beer helmet. And many of them were not wearing shoes. And I have to say it was raining, but everyone was barefoot, and they were squishing gleefully through the farm mud, which was laced with goose droppings and manure. Over on top of the stalls and the woman with the endive hat, there was a big TV that was screening rugby. The music was country. And obviously, I felt this festival actually was a local scene. It was an Afrikaner scene as culturally distinctive in its own way as any Zulu wedding. Since then, I spent nearly 2 years among Afrikaners. And it turns out that this curious mixture of high and low, the walnut grappa honey and the wine helmet, defines post-apartheid Afrikaner culture. And it makes sense to me that their culture would have gone in these two directions at once. On the one hand, I think there's the desire to emphasize one's separateness from Africa, even as one becomes more a part of it. You're refined, you're upper class, your habits and your roots are of Europe. Since '94, Afrikaner cultural festivals showcasing a very highly intellectual kind of poetry and drama have taken off. And so have Afrikaans fine cooking and home improvement magazines. And these cooking magazines showcase a particular type of sort of pseudo-French cooking where the Afrikaner learns how to make a proper baked brie, or these sort of old Dutch delicacies, but something with Chambord butter. And yet at the same time, a defiantly redneck streak in Afrikaner culture has deepened. And the Afrikaners have always been proud of being farmers. Their nickname is Boers, like as in the Boer War, and that just means farmer in Afrikaans. But only after apartheid ended did a whole wildly popular genre of pop music devoted to pickup trucks and cheap brandy emerge. And they developed a huge love for camping. There's like a huge camping culture in Afrikaans culture now, and for walking barefoot in public, even in shopping halls or steak houses. And this side, I think, is about the need to prove that you're at home in Africa, that you're not above it. You're not a pampered colonial tiptoeing around a compound with your gin and tonic. You're from a salty, even working class people, and you didn't even wear shoes to guard yourself from Africa. You dig your toes without shame into its earth. And from the day I saw this strange, sort of mutant-seeming scene at the Wine and Cheese Festival, I became fascinated by the question of how the Afrikaners, this group of people that had held so much power, were adapting to losing it and becoming a visible minority. No matter what Mandela said that morning to these boys, who, by the way, would have been a mix of Afrikaans-speaking and English-speaking South Africans, but a lot of Afrikaans-speaking, it's a certain type of school. So anyway, no matter what he would have said that morning, his very presence on the podium in front of them would have sent a message. It would have posed a sharp challenge. Sometimes when I've talked to American friends about South Africa, I found that they aren't totally aware of how incredibly rigorous apartheid was, far, far beyond Jim Crow. The social separation was extreme. For instance, Indian people were not allowed to set foot in the entire province of the Free State, which is a huge central agricultural province, for more than 24 hours under apartheid because it was not their ethnic area. And of course, partly this was a way for Afrikaners to maintain their social status in their areas unchallenged. But it went far beyond that. Unlike any other colonial group in Africa, after the Dutch arrived at the Cape in the 17th century, they turned their back on their Dutchness very fast. They consciously and strenuously forged a new culture, with new customs and a whole new language. They left the Cape in ox wagons and they penetrated South Africa's wild, lunar central desert. It's an amazing place called the Karoo. And this trek really nourished feelings of manifest destiny and the sense of having a cultural or maybe even God-given mission to open a frontier. And they developed this powerful sense of their uniqueness. They were no longer Europeans, but they were very visibly not quite of Africa either. They called themselves Afrikaners, which is just Africans in Dutch, or the white tribe of Africa. By the late 20th century, revering the idea of cultural distinctness was what it meant to be an Afrikaner. So now, at this moment, this is in '93, history was insisting that they open up that culture, that they let Africa in, and become somehow themselves more fully African too. Now we tend to think of social change as a kind of a game of musical chairs. So, probably before, this guy at the head would have been a white guy, and now he becomes a black guy. And some of these seats will presumably start to fill in with black students, and therefore some of these white guys will have to go somewhere else. But we think less about interchange, about how each one of these young men will have to change inside of himself in order to take up his new role. So what kind of self-reflection and self-redefinition goes on here? Funnily enough, it was a very notorious South African conservative who first made the inner change that would be demanded of Afrikaners clear to me. His name was Karel Boshoff, and I met him in Orania, a tiny old mining town in the middle of the Karoo Desert, where a group of hardcore Afrikaners had trekked kind of just before '94 in order to set up this like all-white enclave. It actually was a ghost town, and they bought it wholesale, bought the whole town, and just that was the only way that they were allowed to keep it all white. And it has become this mecca for foreign journalists in particular, looking for like a quick, wacky dispatch on post-apartheid Afrikaners. And it usually stands in for the idea that white folk in Africa never really get accustomed to blacks, and they just never really change. But I ended up staying there a little bit longer than most journalists, and I lingered all night over a bottle of wine with this guy, Karel. And he turned out to be the scion of one of the most old-school, hardcore Afrikaner families. He is the grandson of Hendrik Vervoerd, who all the people among you will know the infamous, they called him the architect of apartheid. And he was the one who really codified apartheid in the 1960s. But that night in Orania, Karel, his grandson, was insisting to me that he was the radical. And he certainly looked the part. He had this wild, long hair and eyes blinking behind these slightly greasy, sort of owl-round tortoiseshell glasses like a New York beat poet. And he'd filled his house up with esoteric political philosophy books. And he was claiming to me that Orania was the place that was trying to radically undermine the Afrikaners' old way of relating to South Africa by making them do all their own labor. So basically the equation was, since Orania is all white, in Orania, even the janitors are white. And historically, of course, there's been extremely rigid labor apartheid in South Africa. Certain types of jobs were white and others were black. Others were Indian and so on. And after apartheid ended, the white jobs also became open to blacks. But the whites didn't start doing the black jobs. And Boshoff told me he didn't think it was morally or practically sustainable for whites in Africa to eternally rely on black wage labor. So he wanted to press the reset button. But sadly, he told me that most Afrikaners were finding this too hard. They don't want to be janitors. Their fathers weren't janitors. Why must they undergo that diminishment? Or they didn't want to boss around white janitors who might also be their buddies. This was really unfamiliar and uncomfortable. So the funny thing was that although Orania was all white, for many Afrikaners it turned out to be a very unfamiliar place in its social structure. So many who first moved there in this initial trek moved away. And that night, Karl, who was this big sort of philosopher, was very mournful over our wine because he felt he had uncovered a strange and bitter paradox. That in order to stay in the country of their birth, Afrikaners would have to effect a bigger interior change than most could manage to undertake. Let me tell you quickly about another paradox I encountered later on, a year after I met Karl. I moved to a town called Bloemfontein in the Free State, which is the province where the Indians couldn't go under apartheid for more than 24 hours. And my ostensible mission there was to learn Afrikaans, which I picked up some of already because I had found very early on, even while I was still working on writing about medicine, that I fell in love with Afrikaans poetry. The Afrikaners say part of their nationalism project and building themselves up and establishing this new culture in South Africa was to make Afrikaans an academic language, much like the sort of recreation of Hebrew in the 20th century, or I think Indonesian has also gone through that. And so they gave a lot of money to the arts and to poets and novelists and people doing academic work, scientific work in Afrikaans. And some of the poetry that they came up with actually went through like a radical phase, anti-apartheid phase in the 60s, which is probably not what the designers of that project had intended, but it's just incredible. Afrikaans has an amazing body of poetry. So I was trying to learn the poetry, but I couldn't understand the grammar, and I really needed to study it more properly. So I found a mid-level class offered at the University of the Free State. But I had in fact also wanted an entry point into the university for another reason. UFS, University of the Free State, had become totally infamous in South Africa. Like Orania, it had come to represent the idea that white South Africans may never be able to accept the reality of the new South Africa. But it was scarier because the Afrikaners digging in their heels there weren't these kind of aging theorists like Karl Boshoff, but kids who grew up after apartheid ended. So what happened is that in 2008, a video had come out of UFS in which 4 white boys filmed themselves abusing 5 black janitors. And they were pretending to haze the janitors like they were incoming freshmen to the dorm. But it was totally degrading, and they made them pound beers and run races, and at the end, the janitors were made to kneel and drink from a sort of a stew of like kind of composted food scraps into which the boys had pretended to urinate. And in the voiceover, they said they were protesting their dorm's upcoming racial integration. And this was totally incendiary. It went up on YouTube. Actually, so the story supposedly is that one of the boys in the video, he dumped his girlfriend, or he cheated on her, and then she put this video up on YouTube in spite. And this just exploded, and reporters flooded to Bloemfontein. And they quickly determined that all of the dorms at UFS, this is in 2008, which was a 100-year-old historically Afrikaner university, were still racially segregated. And this seemed to demonstrate that somehow, beyond the political sphere and the social sphere and the emotional sphere, apartheid still persisted. And at this Afrikaner university, the Afrikaners had not managed to accept change at all. And the story had been so incredibly hot in South Africa and elsewhere that I felt that I couldn't approach it directly. So I wanted to get to know the university more organically by becoming a student there. So I enrolled, and eventually over coffee one afternoon, my Afrikaans instructor, who was an unusual liberal Afrikaner woman, mentioned something interesting to me, which was that she said that the dorms had not always been segregated. In fact, right after '94, they had integrated really fast. And then at some point, they had turned back. And this to me became this tantalizing mystery. Because one of our most fundamental assumptions about social change is that it goes one way, and the only variable is speed. So these boys will either adapt to their new reality quickly, or more slowly, or maybe not at all, they'll have to emigrate to Australia or something, but we aren't accustomed to thinking of change, of progress, as something that can rush forward and turn back. So I spent the next 6 months filling in over interviews with students and administrators what had happened. And here is the abridged story. At UFS, the dorms were traditionally, historically, more like fraternities. They had legacy admission. If your dad was in a certain dorm, you would be in that one too. And they were suffused with these little traditions. So, like in one dorm, freshmen would wear a certain type of striped jackets. And in another, everybody but the seniors had to walk on a certain path up to the dorm and through the back door. And then when you became a senior, you get to walk through the front door. And in the dorms where they filmed the video, called Rates, they had this very elaborate hazing ritual. In another dorm, they had a pig that the freshmen had to wake up in the morning and feed, and it would wander through the dorm. It was the Mandela pig. Now these traditions were totally arbitrary, but they served the function of distinguishing one dorm from another and fostering a sense of sort of atomized dorm cultures and group pride and belonging. And with such intense dorm cultures, you might imagine that the white students would have been reluctant to let blacks into them and disrupt that. But they weren't, actually. As '94 approached, the university president really worried about the dorms. So he polled the student body to ask their views, and they responded overwhelmingly in favor of opening them up to black students. And in the beginning, the first few black students who braved the historically Afrikaner UFS were really gung-ho about the dorm culture themselves. They were joiners, they were assimilators. They happily wore the jackets and they walked through the right doors. You see, UFS had once been a privileged space, and so it was exciting to be allowed to enter that. One former black student who had lived in a dorm in the early '90s told me, with still this grin on his face, about the pig and about this hazing ritual and how much he loved it. He loved drinking, getting on his knees and drinking that stew because he felt like he was being initiated. He used the word, I remember, ascending. He felt as though he was ascending. And their enthusiasm, in turn, made the white students feel really excited about living together. They felt like they had something good to offer, something worth sharing, and that opening up their culture was really great and really reaffirming. And they even actually bent some of their rules to make it easier on the black students and make them feel welcome. But as more black students came over the course of the '90s, the power balance started to shift. Everybody I talked to mentioned the curious figure of 30%. That was like a demographic hotline. And when the complement of black students in a dorm tipped over 30%, they started sensing their power as a bloc, and they stopped wanting to go along with all of these traditions. They wanted dorm life to reflect their lives, black life. They wanted soccer on the common room TV, reasonably, not rugby all the time. They said that these traditions were white things, and they called attention to the way that some of the traditions eerily reproduced the sense of stifling hierarchy that had characterized apartheid. I mean, black students, for instance, did not appreciate having to walk through back doors and wear silly uniforms and kowtow to mainly still white seniors, like their parents had done in white-ruled South Africa. What was the point of apartheid ending if you were still going to have to do that? So the black students started objecting to these dorm traditions. And when that happened, the formerly enthusiastic white students started to bristle. They hated the implication that the beloved rituals of their daily lives somehow partook of the greater immorality of apartheid? Had the entire Afrikaner lifestyle, and not just Afrikaner politics, been wrong? Was everything tainted? So tension on campus grew, and finally one night, an all-out racial fistfight with like a white flank and a black flank, with hundreds of boys, broke out on this campus. Some guys had to go to the hospital, and some boys even brought guns. And after this, they found troves of Molotov cocktails in some of these dorms that people were stockpiling. You have to understand that this wasn't so long after the armed struggle, which you'd had the white, sort of the fathers of these white students would have been armed by the state, and the ANC was fighting a liberation struggle. So they had access to sort of arms, and they also had access to the idea that things can really escalate, even on a college campus, very quickly to real armed violence. So the administration was horrified. They were totally frightened. They didn't want anyone to get killed in their watch. And I think they were also really frightened of the implications of this. I mean, these guys had been so excited about living together, and years were proceeding after the end of apartheid. This was not supposed to be happening with people this young. And they just were so sort of horrified that they decided to go hands off, and they let the dorms resegregate rather than try to keep pressing this issue. And so the dorms quickly became kind of all white and all black. People just moved where they wanted to move. And in one dorm, they even let the students hammer up plywood that separated black and white corridors. And one entrance became the black entrance, and one became the white entrance. And this happened in '99, which was 5 years, obviously, after legal racial separation in South Africa ended. And so the paradox that I mentioned is that the Afrikaner students did not get used to their new reality. On the contrary, the change became more uncomfortable as it set in, as it proceeded. And that's because the understanding of what the change really was, what it would be, itself changed over time. In the beginning, I don't think the black students realized what they would come to desire out of their newfound access, out of their freedom. And the white students did not anticipate that black liberation would mean more than just blacks joining them in their scene, joining the Afrikaner party as long as they brought the right beer. They didn't anticipate that they too would be changed. And their attitudes hardened. Even while they were still a majority in the dorms, as the black student complements grew, the Afrikaner students really began to sense which way the wind was blowing. And where they had once been willing to bend their rules, by the 2000s, they had come to see their dorm traditions as a metonym for Afrikaner culture. And this was the process of self-redefinition that I mentioned. I mean, striped jackets and going through back entrances and this hazing ritual is in no way, a traditional part of Afrikaner culture or like a cultural good or something, But it was, they were becoming really newly conscious of what it meant to be an Afrikaner. And the traditions were becoming imbued with greater ethnic meaning. I mean, now, being an Afrikaner no longer meant being in power and just being number one. So what was it? What were the cultural goods? What, was it the jacket? What can't we give up before we are giving up too much and just ceding every ground that we had? It was kind of the feeling that was going on. So the university tried to reintegrate the dorms because this was becoming this total public relations problem. Like it was 2005, 2006, and you still had segregated dorms on this historically Afrikaner campus. The government itself was coming and saying, what the hell is this? And so they said, okay, we can just do this. We're going to reintegrate the dorms. And in order to do so, we do have to get rid of some of these traditions because the black students really object to them. And it's their university too now. And this produced such strong opposition. Actually, the main Afrikaner political party did big marches on this campus about self-determination. And they talked about, handed out flyers about, Tibet and Catalonia and minority groups and self-determination and so on. And this became a strange sort of battleground, and the Rates video also was a byproduct of this opposition. I loved learning the texture of this story, and it came to me to seem powerfully archetypal. It was an archetype of demographic change, of how attitudes and expectations change as the power balance between communities shifts. Sometimes I imagine the two communities on this campus as dancers circling each other on a stage, and in those dreamier moments, the story even seemed to me to be an image of love. In the beginning, we desire to bend our own rules, to be with this other who's very different. And then we recoil when we suddenly sense that we might lose ourselves in the bargain. I found it hard to write about UFS, though. My writing was really dense. It exploded with ideas and lessons drawn, and I actually started to worry, how would I communicate this story? After 6 months there, I moved back to Cape Town to report on other things. But I kept thinking of Bloemfontein. The events and characters there were crystallizing into a sort of intellectual constellation for me, fixed stars to guide my ship by. They were helping me make sense of how people in other stories that I was reporting were behaving, or even people in my own personal life. Sometimes I found I even thought of situations in Bloemfontein that I had thought about when I dealt with my own love life. And I think ICWA fellows sometimes wonder, what have I made of my experience? The fellowship is so unusual. Have I converted it into something tangible? A book, a particular kind of job? And if I didn't do that, was I then worthy of it? But I suspect that for many people, the fellowship becomes what Bloemfontein has become for me. It sets your navigational markers. ICWA's mandate, I think, to spend at least 2 years in the field is totally critical here. It's very easy to reach conclusions, for instance, about a group like the Afrikaners, too fast. In other ways, I wonder if ICWA will find itself changing to provide an experience that can set the most ambitious markers for young leaders going forward. Historically, ICWA has been focused on countries and building regional expertise. I think of my experience, though. I went to South Africa, but near the end of my fellowship, I ended up in the Republic of Georgia, in Tbilisi, Georgia, following this group of Afrikaner farmers that were interested in emigrating there. They had been kind of lured or attracted by the Georgian government with the idea that they will rescue the country from the legacy of communism by replanting the farms and fixing the dead communal farms in Georgia, which was very appealing because the Afrikaners had seen themselves in the 80s as fighters against communism in sub-Saharan Africa. That's how they had envisioned themselves. And then everyone told them, no, you were just racist, and that whole thing that you were doing in Angola was just racist. Sorry, you're not fighting the Red Scourge or whatever. So now they can go fight it in Georgia, or the legacy of it. But anyway, so I went there with a group of them. It was totally fascinating. But I found that my people were becoming a diaspora, the people I was studying, and that my fellowship topic was totally decanting from national borders. And as the world becomes more one region and many things worth studying, like urbanization or immigration or how to reclaim wasted lands, are losing the ability to be characterized regionally. And I wish people, for instance, I wish people writing about affirmative action in South Africa would travel to Malaysia and see how they did it there relatively recently, instead of constantly hoofing over the border to Zimbabwe, where all you learn is a really bitter lesson. I'm not taking my own advice. Soon I will be headed back to South Africa to write about, as it were, the other side of this picture, which is how Black South Africans are changing as they enter into the social roles that the Afrikaners are vacating. I found that the drama of South Africa never gets old. It's a very basic archetypal drama of metamorphosis, as well as reconciliation. The question is, can South Africa rewrite this age-old story of eye for an eye and incorporate the oppressors and the oppressed into one society? Or will it explode? It can be exhausting to be a part of that drama, though, and sometimes I see why people emigrate. You don't have to be a racist, although some immigrants definitely are. You only have to be tired of being a player in a play whose plot seems implacable and written by forces so much larger than yourself, in which your audience interprets your every mood according to a never-changing dramaturgy that indicates every gesture is somehow finally about race. To illustrate what I mean, let me ask you to look at this picture one last time. I've described how these white boys are watching Mandela with discomfort, maybe even distaste, how the one on crutches is grimacing with a pain that may not sit only in his bones. I found this photo recently, after a couple of years among Afrikaners, and after that amount of time immersed in this investigation, these boys' expressions spoke to me of something very deep. They spoke of the struggle to accept and adjust to the fact that the tide of history is flowing away from you. How do you live in a country that your fathers worked so hard to keep from ever being born? Except that turned out to be something of a too quick eyeball on this picture. My curiosity about the photo led me to track down the photographer, a woman named Louise Gubb. She still lives in Johannesburg. And I asked her whether any of the boys in the photograph had ever contacted her and what their reaction was. Nobody had ever offered a reaction, she told me, but she had had a reaction to Time magazine's use of the photo to imply that the white boys were sneering at Mandela, just the opposite, she said. Mandela's visit to King Edward VII's school that day was his third school visit of the morning. And the first two were to schools in slum areas just outside Johannesburg. And he had been in the middle, this is what Louise Gubb told me, he'd been in the middle of telling these students about the privation at those other schools. And Louise claimed that their faces were contorted in compassion. This black student was a little distracted, who knows why. Maybe he wasn't as surprised by the stories that Mandela was telling as the other boys were. Anyway, his eyes wandered. He caught the photographer's eye, and he was obviously animated momentarily by the teenage boy's instinct to show off a little, so he grinned and snapped. This image was created that captured as much of what we imagine ought to be as what is. So how to live in such a place, indeed?